Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something I know a lot of you have been asking about: how the Orthodox Church views saints from other Christian denominations. It's definitely an area where things can get a little complicated, so get ready. Our source for this deep dive is Problematic Saints, an Addendum, and it really digs into this tension around Orthodox exclusivity.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. Basically, the Orthodox Church believes that salvation is only possible within its own tradition.
Right.
And this obviously impacts how they see other Christian denominations.
Huh.
The source is pretty upfront about it. If
Right.
you're unorthodox, you can't be a saint.
Okay, so that's like a hard line, right? But then we've got this whole thing with Emperor Trajan. He was a pagan Roman emperor, not even a Christian at all.
Right.
But Orthodox Christians believe he made it to heaven.
Yeah,
Doesn't that kind of go against the idea of Orthodox exclusivity?
it does seem that way.
How does the source explain that?
Well, the source talks about how Trajan's salvation is attributed to the prayers of Pope St. Gregory the Great. Apparently, Gregory saw some good in Trajan, even though he was a pagan.
Huh.
And his prayers are said to have basically gotten Trajan into heaven.
So it was like divine intervention through prayer.
Exactly.
That's a pretty huge exception. But just to be clear, he's in heaven, but he's not considered an official saint.
That's correct.
Okay.
It's definitely an anomaly, not the rule. And it suggests that God's grace can work in ways we might not always understand or expect.
I see what you mean. That definitely adds another layer to this whole discussion. But then it gets even more interesting when we look at Alexei Trupp and Catherine Schneider.
Yes.
They were servants to the Romanov family,
Right.
and they were actually canonized as saints in 1981 by a group called the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, or ROKOR for short.
Mm-hmm.
The catch is Trupp was Catholic and Schneider was Lutheran.
Yeah.
That raises some serious questions
Oh, does.
about how Orthodoxy views sainthood and how they see other denominations.
It really does. I mean, it seems like a straight-up contradiction.
Right. Absolutely. So what's the explanation for that?
Well, the source suggests that both Trupp and Schneider were in the process of converting to Orthodoxy when they died.
I'm not sure I buy that.
Why?
How much weight should we really put on these deathbed conversions?
I have a fair point.
And what evidence is there even to support that claim?
The source acknowledges those concerns, but they emphasize the close relationship Trupp and Schneider had with the Romanov family, who themselves are considered saints.
Right.
And the idea is that being so close to this strong faith really had an influence on their spiritual journey.
So are we saying their conversion and then their sainthood was almost like a miracle orchestrated by the Romanovs?
It is an interesting theory, but you're right, it is quite speculative. And what's even more interesting is that after ROKOR rejoined the Moscow Patriarchate, it seems like they kind of distanced themselves from these saints.
Really? So they're kind of like, yeah, we made them saints, but let's not talk about it too much.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how much politics and historical context play into these decisions.
For sure. Their canonization really pushes the boundaries of what's considered acceptable. It makes you think, how flexible are these boundaries? And who ultimately gets to decide where those lines are drawn?
That's a great question.
And that leads us to another interesting case, Saint Glycery. Now, he's not as well known, but he adds another layer of complexity to this whole problematic saints thing. Saint Glycery founded the old-style Romanian Orthodox Church, which is considered true Orthodoxy. So can you explain what true Orthodoxy is?
Sure. True Orthodoxy refers to groups of churches that have broken away from mainstream Orthodoxy. They believe that they're the ones upholding the true traditions and doctrines, like the mainstream churches have kind of strayed from the original path.
So they're like the Orthodox purists.
You could say that, and this is where St. Glycery's story gets really interesting. He was canonized by both the true Orthodox Communion and maybe even ROKOR independently.
Hold on. So both these groups recognized a saint from a group that's technically considered outside of salvation by mainstream Orthodoxy?
Yes.
That's a pretty bold move.
It is. It challenges the Orthodox Church's view of true Orthodoxy. And it raises questions about who has the authority to recognize sainthood. If both ROKOR and true Orthodoxy, groups considered outside by the mainstream, can agree on someone's sanctity, what does that say about traditional power structures within the church?
It's almost like these problematic saints are poking holes in this whole idea of Orthodox exclusivity.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
So what do you make of that?
Well, the source uses these examples, especially St. Glycery's case, to argue for the need to reconsider our relationships with other denominations, especially true Orthodoxy. Maybe there's more common ground than we think.
Okay.
And maybe, just maybe, these figures could be like bridges between these seemingly separate branches of Christianity.
That's a really interesting idea. So after looking at these three cases, do you think these problematic saints are actually problematic for the Orthodox Church? Or could they be, I don't know, helpful in some way?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll keep exploring as we dive deeper into the source material. But what's clear is that these individuals challenge some of our assumptions about sainthood, grace, and the boundaries between denominations.
Right.
And they force us to really grapple with the complexities and nuances within Orthodoxy, and maybe even within Christianity as a whole.
And for all of our listeners, I think this brings up a crucial question. If saints can seemingly come from outside of the traditional Orthodox world, what does that tell us about grace and salvation?
Right.
Could God's reach extend beyond the limits of one specific church? It's definitely something to think about.
You know, it's interesting you use the word helpful. The source actually argues that these problematic saints might be agents of change within Orthodoxy.
Right.
Like they're challenging how strict they are about being exclusive and maybe pushing them to be more inclusive of other Christian traditions.
Oh, wow. So you're saying these figures who seem to contradict Orthodox doctrine, they could actually be pushing the church toward being more open. How would that even work?
Well, by highlighting these figures who kind of blur the lines between denominations, the source is encouraging us to reconsider those lines. You know, maybe they're not as absolute or as impermeable as we think. Maybe there's room for a more, I don't know, nuanced understanding of sainthood. One that recognizes that God's grace can work outside of the official boundaries of the Orthodox Church.
So you're saying these problematic saints, they're like these cracks in the wall of exclusivity, and they could lead to a more welcoming approach to other Christians.
Yeah, exactly. And what I find particularly interesting is that the author really focuses on true orthodoxy.
Okay.
Remember, these are the groups that are often seen as the most separatist, but the source sees potential for reconciliation there.
Okay, I'm curious about that. What does the source say about how these problematic saints could actually help bring world orthodoxy and true orthodoxy closer together?
Well, it goes back to the idea of shared saints, like St. Glycery. When both sides acknowledge the sanctity of individuals who belong to these separated groups, they're implicitly saying that the other side isn't completely without God's grace.
Right.
It might be a small step, but it's still significant.
So finding this common ground, like this shared reverence for a certain person, it could create a bridge between these two worlds that seems so opposed.
Exactly. It opens up the possibility for dialogue, for understanding, and maybe even for a gradual softening of those hard boundaries that have kept these groups apart.
That's a really hopeful way to look at it. It's like these saints are acting as these go-betweens, these spiritual ambassadors, helping to bridge the divide.
And what's even more interesting is that it's not just a theory. The source actually points to examples of shared saints, like St. Martidiatissa of Clysora, who was canonized by both true Orthodoxy and the Ecumenical Patriarchate.
Oh, really? So this is already happening. There are saints recognized by both world orthodoxy and true orthodoxy.
It seems so. These cases might not be super well known, but they show that maybe there's this quiet movement within Orthodoxy towards a more ecumenical approach. This recognition that sanctity and grace can go beyond those denominational boundaries.
That's really exciting. It's like these problematic saints are leading the way, showing us that there's another path, one based on understanding, shared reverence, and a broader view of God's work in the world.
And here's where things get really interesting. If we accept that sainthood is ultimately up to God, can any human institution, even the Orthodox Church, really say they have the sole authority to recognize it?
Wow, that's a big question. You're saying we need to rethink the whole idea who gets to decide who's a saint and who isn't. Are you suggesting that maybe the church doesn't have the final say?
It's a question worth thinking about. If God's grace can work in ways we don't always expect, then maybe our human attempts to define and limit it are always going to fall short. Maybe these problematic saints are reminding us that God's plan is bigger than any single church or denomination.
It makes you wonder what else is out there. Like, what other stories of sanctity are waiting to be found? Ones that challenge our ideas and push us towards a bigger understanding of faith.
Yeah, it's an invitation to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep our minds open to the possibility that God might be working in ways we haven't even thought of.
That's a great point. It reminds me of something a priest once told me. He was talking about how our understanding of God will always be incomplete, and that we should always be open to the possibility of God working in ways that we don't understand or even agree with.
That's wise. It's so important to remember that we're all on a journey when it comes to faith and understanding.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners, we encourage you to explore this world of orthodoxy and its saints. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions, to challenge your own assumptions,
Mm.
and see where those questions take you.
And remember, these problematic saints aren't just interesting stories. They're invitations to rethink what we believe, to expand our understanding of faith, and embrace the complexity and mystery of the Christian tradition.
And who knows, maybe by doing that, it will lead to a more unified and compassionate church in the future.
That's definitely something worth working towards.
For sure. Until next time, everyone, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. It feels like with this topic, we've just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah,
These problematic saints are more than just like weird exceptions. They're making us rethink some really big ideas about orthodoxy,
right.
like its relationship with other parts of Christianity.
Absolutely. I think what's so interesting is how these cases show that tension between what the church officially teaches and how people actually live out their faith. Like the church might be really firm on the idea of exclusivity,
Uh-huh.
but then you have these people who seem to be full of God's grace, but they don't fit neatly into the categories. It makes you wonder
Mm-hmm.
what's more important, what institutions say,
Yeah.
or how people actually experience faith.
It's like these saints are saying, hey, God works in mysterious ways, so don't be so quick to draw those hard lines. But how do we even start to bring those ideas together? They seem so contradictory. And the church is built on tradition and doctrine.
That's the core issue, isn't it? The source doesn't give us easy answers.
Yeah.
But it does encourage us to kind of sit with that complexity. Maybe the key is recognizing that we'll never fully understand God.
Yeah.
We can hold on to our traditions while also accepting that God's grace might show up in ways that challenge those traditions.
So instead of seeing these problematic saints as threats to what Orthodoxy believes, we could see them as opportunities.
Absolutely.
Like opportunities to understand our faith better,
Yeah.
to be more open to God, working in ways and places we might not expect.
Exactly. They can remind us that humility and openness are important parts of having a mature faith. They can also inspire us to find common ground with other Christians,
Right.
recognizing that our love for Christ might be more important than our differences in doctrine.
This whole conversation has me thinking about the future of Orthodoxy. Mm-hmm.
If these problematic saints are any sign, it seems like more and more people in the church are moving towards more ecumenism.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a real possibility? Could we see a future where the lines between different denominations aren't so rigid?
I think it's a possibility worth hoping for. And I think the source makes a strong argument for it. By showing us these shared saints, these people who go beyond those traditional divisions, it plants a seed for a more inclusive and unified Christianity. It's a vision that really speaks to the spirit of love and fellowship that's at the heart of Christianity.
It's a beautiful vision,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people, no matter what denomination they belong to, would find it really inspiring. It reminds us that we're all part of something so much bigger than ourselves,
Yeah.
and that we're all united by our faith in Christ.
That's a powerful message to take away from this deep dive. Ultimately, these problematic saints are challenging us to move past those narrow definitions and rigid boundaries. They're inviting us to embrace the mystery and wonder of faith and to look for unity and understanding across all of Christianity. For everyone listening, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and be open to the possibility that God is working in ways you might not expect. And who knows, maybe these problematic saints will help us all understand more deeply what it means to be a follower of Christ.
I love that. Until next time, keep the conversation going.